thank you for joining me. I am joined by Dr. Luisa Enria, Dr. Elizabeth Smout and Tom Mooney, who all had various roles linked to a trial of an Ebola vaccine, EboVac, which was led by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Tom, you were the communications manager for EboVac. Elizabeth was the community engagement coordinator, and Luisa was the social scientist linked to the EboVac trial. So let's kick off before we talk about those different roles and how you found your places against one another, because they're obviously quite overlapping. What was EboVac? Can you explain the trial to us?
Sure. So EBOVAC-Salone is a clinical trial of an Ebola vaccine, the prime boost Ebola vaccine, which was developed by Janssen Pharmaceuticals, and the trial began in Sierra Leone in 2015 towards the end of the West African Ebola outbreak. It was led by the London School in partnership with the University of Sierra Leone's College of Medicine and Allied Health Sciences. So it was a trial. It's recruited just over 1,000 adults, children and infants in the Kambia district of Northern Sierra Leone. And recruitment into the study is now finished, but participants are still in the study for long-term follow-up. And the study is looking at the safety and immune response generated by these vaccines.
Okay, thank you. And so can you paint the picture? This started in 2015. What was the context like in Sierra Leone? What did you find when you hit the ground?
I think Beth was there first, so I think Beth's probably the best person for context.
Yep, so I arrived in Sierra Leone in February 2015. So at that time, I think I would say the Ebola outbreak had just come across its peak. So I remember there were still large number of cases being reported every single day. So we were still in the middle of an outbreak, which brought its own challenges when it came to setting up a clinical trial. There was obviously a huge infrastructure around the Ebola response. It was busy. It was slightly chaotic. It was manic. There were lots of different groups involved trying to do different things, all to bring the Ebola response to an end as quickly as possible. It was probably a little bit calmer by the time that Luisa and Tom arrived in June of 2015, but it was still very much an active outbreak. And so for the trial, it was about moving the trial forward and setting up a trial associated with the response, but not as part of the response. It had to be clear that it was very different. We were testing something that we didn't know if it was going to work. But to try and set something up while you had an active outbreak going on was incredibly difficult.
What were some of the difficulties? Because what I remember from what I saw on television was that there was a huge amount of fear, a huge amount of media attention, and a huge volume of people descending on the area in order to respond in a humanitarian capacity.
From a perspective of a clinical trial, I think one of the biggest difficulties that we had was, obviously our role was solely to do research, but research was not the number one priority, quite rightly, of the response as a whole. So you had to work alongside the response while not doing anything that might prevent the main emergency response from actually happening. I don't know if you've got any.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective as a social scientist, actually it's kind of quite closely linked to the fear that you're talking about, in the sense that social scientists and anthropologists in particular were kind of called in to be part of the emergency response and then of different kinds of interventions, precisely because there was a recognition that there was a sort of a huge amount of mistrust in both in the kind of national institutions that were implementing the response, but also in the international intervention. A lot of fear and kind of concerns around what this kind of unprecedented outbreak meant, where it came from, what the implications might be. And so I think you're right in pointing out that there was a huge amount of fear and on all sides, I think, of the response. And I think that was quite an important dimension of the kind of everyday experience of the outbreak for the people in Sierra Leone and the people who had arrived as part of the humanitarian response.
And how did that manifest? Were there rumours about what some of the work you were doing was trying to do?
Yes, so I think one of the kind of major aspects of our work from the social science team and then in collaboration with the community engagement team, which we'll talk about in a second, was to kind of track those kinds of rumors and narratives around the trial. But I think that wasn't the only kind of narrative and dynamic that was going on. That was very much situated in broader kind of social understandings of what the epidemic was and kind of concerns, anxieties that were surrounding the epidemic and the intervention as well. So in a sense, the rumors around the trial, the fears of what it might mean, especially in a part of the country that had never really experienced medical research before, were very much linked to the narratives and the rumors around the epidemic more generally.
So you've alluded a little bit to your different roles and responsibilities, but I get the feeling that you all ended up having to coordinate quite closely and work together quite closely, which is evident in the relationships, the strong relationships that I can see you have. Can you explain a bit about what your separate roles were to begin with, and then we can start to think about what the overlap was?
Sure, I can start. So I was brought in as the communications manager with primarily a focus on kind of external communications, media, kind of stakeholder relations, and probably the overall messaging for the project as to what the project was doing, our objectives, and why we were doing it. Now, as time went on, I guess the post was originally necessary because this was setting up a trial in a country affected by Ebola at a time of a huge amount of interest, and they wanted kind of a person with some dedicated kind of marketing and PR experience, rather than community engagement, as well as community engagement, to be doing some of that, like I say, that external facing stuff rather than the community facing communication. So that was my kind of original role there, and it did it was necessary, of course, to work very closely, particularly with Beth, who was our community engagement lead to start with. And then the two of our roles gradually kind of came closer and closer together, particularly as the need for external communications diminished after the trial was up and running smoothly and the outbreak had ended. That kind of, media interest, things like that, obviously kind of dropped right off. But what we were finding was that we needed a lot of work in the community to maintain confidence and trust in the trial and things like that. So I ended up working a lot more closely with Beth as time went on.
Yeah, I would just say that Tom and I essentially, we co-managed the community engagement team. I would say it was very much done kind of in partnership, the two of us together. I guess I probably did more community engagement at the beginning, but originally I was there on my own and essentially attempting to do all three roles, which was completely impossible. So when two more people came on board, it was brilliant. And I think we're all very close. We all work together very closely. Tom and I particularly basically did the same job but split it, and I think it was really helpful for us to have two slightly different perspectives, backgrounds, experiences on kind of what we decided to do going forward. So I'd trained as a doctor. I'd come from a more academic background. Tom had this kind of PR, external comms background that I had no knowledge of before. And so I think it worked really well together. I think it was kind of an ideal combination. And then I would say that our team then sat alongside Louisa's team, and I don't know if you want to explain.
Yeah, no,
more.
sure. Yeah, so our team, the social science team, was we had our own mini research project alongside, I guess, sort of studying broadly kind of community acceptance of the vaccine and the experience of Ebola and how that was influencing the running of the trial and people's decisions to join the trial. And we were doing kind of ethnographic work, and I had hired kind of a local team of ethnographers as well. So we kind of had a double role in the sense that we were doing this study, but then we were working very closely with Beth and Tom, kind of feeding back some of the findings sort of rapidly and live, let's say, that were relevant to the running of the trial, and in particular to the community engagement. And I think, I don't know for me, but I think we agreed, we were quite proud of the kind of system that we developed or invented, or kind of now see as one of the major products of our collaboration, but it kind of came out quite organically in the sense that we were figuring it out as we were on the ground, trying to understand, okay, how do we make this work, and how do we have some sort of research-based communication strategy, essentially.
Because I've heard that other anthropologists working in the context were often expected to do community engagement work as well.
Yes, so this is something that I really emphasize, because I think that it was quite important. We use it with EboVac as an example of why it can be very productive to separate the two, in the sense that we were able to build trust in the community and kind of get the kind of research and kind of conversations going that you might not be able to get if at the same time you were trying to kind of pass a message about the trial. So that we were able to maintain some level of independence, whilst of course being open about the fact that we were embedded in the trial, but being able to basically listen and then feed back what we thought might be relevant for the sort of more kind of outward-facing community engagement.
Yeah. So you'd feed back into the clinical trial protocol as well?
Not as much, to some extent, yes. So we had different kinds of methods. So we would do community ethnography. So we'd sit in kind of some of the popular areas in Kambia, in the town where the trial was going on, and kind of hear and listen to what people were understanding, what people's perceptions and feelings about the trial were. If we felt that there were, for example, a rumor or something that needed to be addressed, we would feed it back to the communications team, so to Beth and Tom, anonymously. So not say, this guy is saying that the vaccine is here to kill people, but we would kind of say, this is maybe some of the messaging that you need to work on. But we also had, and then they would address it through their communication strategies. But we also had some exit interviews. So as people came out of the clinic after their visit, we would be able to kind of collect some data very quickly about if there was anything maybe going on in the clinic that could be adjusted or that could be addressed. So that was feeding directly back into the clinical trial.
And Elizabeth, we hear the word community engagement a lot, but quite often it can mean very different things to different groups of people. So do you want to elaborate a little bit on what the objectives were within what you were doing?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question as well when you were within the context of a wider outbreak, because there was obviously community engagement around the general outbreak as a whole, and then there was our specific work that we were trying to do. So really our job was to inform people about the trial, why we were there, what being in the trial involved, and to provide enough information that would allow people to make an informed decision about whether or not they wanted to participate. So we were obviously giving a large amount of information to people, but I would say quite strongly, and I'm sure Tom would agree, we didn't see our role as being to convince people that they should take part in the study, and that was really important. It was really, really important that this wasn't seen as
a recruitment drive,
and not the kind of engagement that you would see around proven interventions that would happen all the time. Like, this wasn't a polio vaccine that was licensed, and we had to be really careful about how it was presented. So it was really about giving people information in a way that they could understand, so that they could then decide whether or not this was the right decision for them.
Yeah, and so to be clear, so the community engagement team there were all locally employed staff from the town, and that's obviously incredibly important. It's not a job that Beth or I could go and do, and these the team there were instrumental in developing the community engagement strategy, the messaging, all of that, and then going and actually delivering the messages. But I guess our role was, in part, this kind of the link between the clinical trial and the clinical trial protocol and the community, and us being able to do that because we were, we understood that this was not a proven intervention, and I think it was kind of our mantra to the staff, and it still is. I still work in the role with the team. Is that you're not there to convince anybody to take this. This is not like other community engagement jobs that you've done. So most of the staff there, because the skills and experience were relevant. Many of them come from a kind of social mobilisation or community engagement background. Many of the team there, and we've constantly been at pains to be sure to be, you're not there to cajole somebody into taking part in this study or to convince them to take part in this study. You're there to, you're doing your engagement, or you're passing your message in a different way. Your message is to provide information to people so they can make a choice, and that message has to be, ethically sound. It has to be sound within what is going to happen to your participant if they are part of a trial. It has to reflect what is in the trial protocol. And so I think that's quite different to some of the other engagement work that even some of these same individuals had been doing when they may have worked in the Ebola response. Absolutely, they were there to encourage and cajole people to wash their hands, undertake safe burials of Ebola victims. And that was, we were absolutely at pains to make that distinction between the two kinds of engagement.
So you had to work with people who are working on the ground in the face-to-face work to encourage them to understand that recruitment wasn't your primary goal, that ethics was your primary goal. Yet, did you find that people more senior than yourselves on the clinical side appreciated that that was your role as well? Or was there pressure to recruit from that?
I mean, there is pressure to recruit, but because you can't run a clinical trial without participants. But we're working in a team of experienced trialists who also understand the ethics requirements of how to recruit participants into a clinical trial. And you can't completely separate community engagement for a clinical trial from participant recruitment from a clinical trial, because part of the message has always got to be how you go about going to join this trial. And that ultimately is why you're there, building relationships with the community, is so that the trial can take place, so you can gather that data, so this product can potentially be used in the future. So the two can't be completely separated, but I think I could definitely see scenarios, and I'm kind of aware of trials elsewhere in the world where I've spoken to people who've worked in these scenarios where there is huge pressure to recruit, and they are basically a recruitment team. But there are certainly ethical questions around that, and I think working with experienced trialists who have done this plenty of times before and understand the limitations on you in terms of recruiting people within really strict ethical boundaries, that's really, really important.
So did you feel that the work of community engagement and of the social research attached to EboVac was recognised as for the value that it brought to the EboVac trial?
Definitely. I mean, we were all part of the management team of the trial, equally to the clinicians and the other staff. I don't feel that we were ever sort of pushed to one side, and I think it was and still is widely acknowledged that the work that we did was really important. I think we would all feel that it's really important. Certainly there has been quite a lot of interest from other groups, other people, in the way that we went about this community engagement and social science collaboration, and that interaction and what that brought and the added value that it had. And I think things had to adapt and change, and I think that's made it more interesting as we've gone along. But I would definitely say that it was important and it was valued, and I think we were part of all of the discussions around changes to the protocol, around when there were, if there were issues with recruitment, it felt like we could come in and offer advice to that. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think also one thing that's important to remember, especially about the kind of setup phase, was it was quite a stressful kind of high pressure environment. And so we all worked really closely together, also kind of on a human level. I think we all lived together actually as well, which was kind of had its pros and cons. But I think it was quite a close team in that sense. And I think that one thing that I found really valuable, I think other people did as well, is that we were learning also how to translate each other's work. And that's always challenging, and it's something that, takes time and adjustment. But we all speak slightly different languages in terms of, if you're an anthropologist, if you're doing community engagement, if you're a clinician. And I think that was one of the most kind of productive spaces, and not always smooth, of course, because there is tensions when you're trying to translate those things, or when we understand things slightly differently. But I think it was productive, and we came up with some really kind of innovative ways of doing things, or of kind of combining different disciplines together as well.
And I think it really helped that we were all learning. So we did, like Tom said, there were hugely experienced trialists working as part of the team, but no one had done this kind of trial in this kind of environment before. And so I think we all went through that process of learning together, of appreciating each other's work, what we could each bring to the team. And I think there was that acknowledgement that everybody learnt something from everybody else, whatever that was.
Can you talk a little bit about what the actual community engagement programme looked like, and what sort of interactions people were having with communities?
So we had various different approaches to community engagement. I think we were both very clear from early on that one strategy wasn't going to work for everything. And as Tom said earlier, everything was done with our team of Kambian staff who would say, this will work here, no, that won't work there. So we had, I would say, more formal processes. So we had, all of the meetings that you had to go through with the various key stakeholders in the community, like the chief. We would have one-to-one discussions with them. We would have fairly formal meetings with the chiefs in the area, with religious
leaders.
Yeah. And then it sort of span out from there, I guess, into more localised things. So that might be more community meetings. We had a drama that was developed with a team of local actors. It was people going around with a megaphone to the market and generating some interest in the trial, or people having one-to-one conversations with market stall holders.
Yeah, team members going door to door with information packs to discuss with people individually about the trial. So the community engagement methods there were all kind of very low tech. So there's no media consumed in Kambia apart from community radio, and we did use community radio as a channel, but there's no television there and there's no newspapers there. So everything therefore is, well, almost everything apart from the bit of community radio is done face to face, and a lot of it actually you find is dependent on personal relationships, or even if they're not a personal relationship, if it's okay, well you're from the town, so I'm willing to listen to you, or I'm more likely to trust you.
And given that you had this relational approach and you can't measure your success in terms of recruitment, how did you understand your success and know that things were working?
I mean, maybe that's also to some extent somewhere where we could come in kind of from the social science perspective, in the sense that we were also not a check, because that makes it seem like we were kind of policing the community engagement, but much more about kind of testing how the messaging was going down and how it was spreading within communities, and I think I think a lot of the time it was quite positive in a sense as well, and so being able to kind of figure out which messages were working, what means of messaging was working too, so which ones were better suited. I think one thing that we we tried to do it as well was power mapping. So kind of figuring out within each area, for example, in the town, okay, there might be the kind of the formal, the formally recognized leader, whether it's a chief or a religious leader or other forms of leadership, but there might be also kind of informal influencers or people who matter or whose views matter. And so being able to kind of pass that on and then passing those messages through those people, having those kind of building those relationships with those people, I think we were then able to kind of track the message throughout the community as well.
So it was a really responsive program because of the depth of interactions that you were having in different contexts.
Yeah, I think without the social science feedback, our community engagement could have looked very different and wouldn't have been as flexible or responsive to issues that came up, because we just wouldn't have had that information. We might have got some trickle down from some of our staff members, but they've got a vested interest, they're part of the team, so to have a slightly independent group was brilliant. And there isn't a benchmark, I think, after like past which point you say, okay, that is successful, this is working, because you would have days where you felt like the messaging worked really well, and there would be other days where a rumour would pop up. But I think it was knowing that we had that feedback, that we could be responsive, having a mechanism by which after we'd changed a strategy or gone and done some additional work in a particular area, Louisa's team could then go and see, was that making any difference? So I guess that's how we measured success, was on these small scale kind of responses. And did that seem to have an impact?
Yeah, and Beth mentioned that flexibility, and we were lucky, we were fortunate that we were able to be flexible because so we partnered in community engagement with World Vision, the NGO there, who held a decent sized budget for this work under the EBOVAC grant. So it's a linked grant to the grant for the clinical trial, and they provided both staff but also financial support and some sort of community engagement leadership to us as well. But it really helped with being able to be flexible. So we, as the trial went on and as we recruited different cohorts of people, so we started with adults, then we moved into adolescents, older children, and finally infants. The community engagement strategy, the methods, the messaging have all kind of adapted as we've gone along, and that's been possible because we've had people who are willing to be flexible with us in terms of providing resourcing, doing it quickly and being helpful. And you do need to be able to move quite quickly actually in these kind of environments, particularly if you're dealing with a rumour. Which has the potential to be really damaging to a clinical trial, either to your recruitment numbers. And I know we said it's not all about recruitment, and it isn't, but also to participants who are already in the study. If there's a rumour going around about their participation, that they've taken a poison, that they're selling their blood, that that they've sold out for some reason, that can be really damaging to the participants who have made a decision to join the trial. And I think you have a duty of care as a community engagement team, as the trial, to look after those people as well as protect your own reputation. So we were able to be flexible in dealing with rumours because we would deal with things almost immediately. The social science team under Louisa's leadership would provide us feedback quite often same day if there was a new emerging issue, and we would be able to dispatch a team to engage either with a trusted figure there that we could use have as an influencer there, or we would go and hold a area meeting with members of the community there directly, sometimes that day, sometimes the next morning, to address this, invite questions from people and try and get to the bottom of where this where this rumor had come from, and if there was something that we could do to kind of provide the correct information or make people feel more at ease.
That sounds wonderful, but also incredibly intense. Was it? How did you guys fare under that kind of pressure?
Yeah, I mean, it was a strange time, wasn't it? I think that it was incredibly intense to be working in a situation where everything was done so quickly and rapidly and needed to have that turnaround. It was also intense because you were working within a wider emergency response, which was so full on that even if you were slightly to one side of it, you couldn't escape that sense of urgency and a sense of stress. And it's also intense because you're all, I mean, for us, we're all away from home, we're all living together. You're in a strange, it's not just that you're in a different country in a different setting. You're in a different country in a different setting in an emergency situation. So it felt like nothing about that is really normal.
Yeah, and I think another layer of intensity as well, and I think we all felt it, was the fact that our staff, or the staff that we'd recruited, were from the community, and so they kind of had a whole much more complex and very challenging relationship in terms of their position within the community once having been hired by the trial. And so kind of being very invested in, of course, kind of making sure that something that was seen as a good for the community, both in terms of the actual vaccine, but also kind of a big investment in the community as well, kind of went well. And so I think for us, it was, of course, we were fully committed to the vaccine trial being successful. We were possibly even more committed to it being kind of ethical and being kind of grounded in the community and making sure that it kind of created the right relationships. But for our staff who were from there, I think there was a whole other layer of kind of personal intensity, also having been in Kambia when the epidemic was at its worst, I think.
Yeah. And these are staff who are continuing to work?
Yep, yeah. So they're still employed by EboVac in Kambia. So the trial is ongoing there, doing long-term follow-up of participants who are already enrolled. So the participants are coming in for visits at 2, 3, or 6 month intervals perhaps, and having blood draws still, so we can still look at the safety and immune response. So the community engagement team is still in post, social science team is still in post, and we've been involved in another large clinical trial around an hour away from our original trial site called PREVAC, and we've just completed recruiting 700 participants in there, and that's a trial of 2 different Ebola vaccines, one of which is the EboVac vaccine, another one is the Merck vaccine, which is currently being used in the DRC, but filling some of the gaps in data that there are there in young children and long-term follow-up. So yeah, the staff are still there, still working.
So it's been a long-term commitment as well as having this short, sort of very intense early stage, and the context, I suppose, in terms of community engagement and communications has also changed.
Yeah, so we began our community engagement in probably July 2015. So at that point, this was the tail end of the epidemic, and we enrolled the first patient participant in October 2015, and the outbreak was declared over in early 2016. So after a couple of kind of false starts of the country reaching the period after which it would be declared Ebola-free, and then another case popping up. Eventually, in early 2016, the country was declared Ebola-free. And it didn't necessarily have a huge impact, actually, on what we were doing, because there'd been so few cases in Kambia and in Sierra Leone for quite a while. But it did immediately lift the emergency restrictions, and what we found was that literally overnight, a lot of the emergency responders left. So there were large numbers of INGOs and international organisations in the town. Big kind of setup of field tents around the district council, all housing British military or UN or WHO, and that whole infrastructure was dismantled very, very quickly. And I think I kind of remember us all sitting around chatting one Friday evening and being like, it kind of feels like we're the only people left, and there. And it just happened very, very quickly. But what that meant was lots of people who had been employed by the Ebola response suddenly found themselves without a job. So, the Ebola response was terrible for all the lives that were lost. It was also devastating for the economy, but it did employ some people. And it was strange just being there and seeing, a couple of days later being approached by people saying, well, okay, EboVac, you're what's left here. Do you have jobs for us? I thought, well, no, because actually we're fully employed at the moment. But it was a very quick transition, I found. And I've not been involved in emergency response before. I haven't seen whether that's normal or not. But it just felt like almost incredibly fast. It changed overnight, didn't it?
Yeah, it was so sudden. I think that was almost the weirdest time of the whole thing. It was almost stranger than the time when we had the curfews and movement restrictions and things like that. It was like everything was meant to suddenly go back to normal after all of this history of everything that had happened for the last couple of years, and it was really bizarre.
Yeah, and it's actually, so I'm still doing some research in the region, and one of the things in that area in particular, and what's been really interesting is exactly what Tom is saying, in the sense that you might expect the memories of Ebola itself, of course, are awful and kind of painful, but a lot of it is about the kind of development almost that people saw in the area that they hadn't seen before, and so now there is almost kind of a memory of the response as a moment where people started seeing the kinds of investment that they would like to see in their community. And I think EboVac has been quite symbolic of that, in the sense that, if Ebola hadn't happened, you wouldn't have had such a big project that's employing so many people and kind of sustaining livelihoods there. I think it's like one of those things that you don't really think about when you're thinking about moments of crisis like Ebola.
It also makes me wonder how contingent the relationships and the reputation you have is on other organisations and the relationships that they have, and how their leaving must have impacted on that.
Yeah, I think we were always very conscious of the fact, as Beth mentioned earlier, so we were not part of the emergency response, and we had to be there kind of alongside it, making absolutely sure we didn't interfere with it, because the emergency response and getting to zero Ebola cases was more important than the research that we were doing there. But I think we certainly attempted to create that absolute distinction between what we were doing and the response. I don't remember people being kind of really shocked and surprised to find that EboVac was still there when the rest of the responders left. I think we were always very clear that this was a longer term project. Now, it was initially only going to be for 1 or 2 years, and then the follow-up now is longer, so the project has become longer term. But I mean, I don't remember it making a kind of a vast difference to the kind of the work we were doing there. But one thing that we did have to do in terms of community engagement and kind of positioning the trial was that the emergency response infrastructure kind of disappeared overnight and kind of went back to a more of a business as usual health management infrastructure. And we found that very quickly some of our stakeholders had changed. So some very key figures suddenly had no role at all anymore, no official role. So the key figures in the Ebola response in the district, who would have been some of our absolute go-to people, we'd keep them informed, we'd engage them, we'd consult them on various things, suddenly had no role whatsoever to play, and that distinction was made absolutely overnight. And so we had to go and quickly figure out what was happening now and go and build those new relationships very quickly and make sure that we were still tied in with the right people.
And I think also, I think the kind of one of the benefits amongst many of being in a place over a longer period of time than being an emergency response is the ability precisely of, first of all, understanding those dynamics, but also being able to build trust and relationships over time. And I think that was one of the things that the trial was able to do, I think, is to be different in a sense, and from those short-lived interventions that, it doesn't only happen during emergencies, I guess, in countries like Sierra Leone. So I think that investment that the community engagement team made in building relationships was really valuable in the trial's ability to continue after the epidemic as well.
Yeah, definitely. It was one of those things where everything happened really quickly and it had to be fast. But actually, in terms of relationships, it was a slow burn, really. But that worked really, really well. I think people knowing that we were going to be there for a while automatically makes a difference. Those reassurances that we weren't going to suddenly disappear, because that's just not how this project worked. But it takes a long time. You don't build that trust overnight, and it does make a difference if you can be an organisation that is seen to stay beyond the end, even if that was always the plan right from the beginning, to sort of see it through. And I'm sure now, seeing that long-term follow-up still going on, by now the relationships that you will have are so strong because
Yeah,
they've
I mean,
been
we're
built
just
on
an
years and
established
years
part
of
of the
work.
community now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also, so while London School is, kind of one of the lead organisations for this trial, it's not, the vast majority of the staff there are not from London School. They're employed by the College of Medicine, World Vision and Goal, so another NGO who have, a Sierra Leonean presence, and they had a presence in Kambia anyway. So, whether people see you as EboVac or they see you as College of Medicine or Goal or World Vision, it's quite like a complicated mix, but these are more established partners who have been there in the country or even in the district for quite a while, and will maintain a presence there after EboVac has gone.
Right, okay. So there'll be a sort of sustained relationship with some of the capacity that you've built as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, particularly World Vision and the College of Medicine, like both of those organisations, particularly World Vision, without clinical research experience before they came into this consortium, and that was a new experience for them. But I think overall capacity has been built there, particularly in terms of community engagement around response and around clinical trials. And then within the College of Medicine, there was some research experience there before, but not a lot in terms of sort of big vaccine trials. And I think that capacity will be there within the College of Medicine, hopefully within the leadership and the clinical staff on the ground to go and do this kind of thing in the future without having to have a London School or someone else come in and kind of help with the setup phase of it.
So this is a little bit of a provocation, but it is an attitude that one sometimes encounters because the time pressure around an epidemic outbreak is so acute. What would you say to people that might suggest that community engagement is an added luxury, and really what you need to do is just get your research up and running, and the community engagement can come later?
I mean, these guys will answer better, but my immediate reaction would be that doesn't actually work, in the sense that a lot of the time you can't get you wouldn't be able to get the research up and running without the community engagement. And I'm certain actually that we couldn't have set up the EboVac trial without the community engagement. And I think that is both kind of for the kinds of crisis management or the issues with rumors that we were talking about, but much more important and much more fundamentally in terms of building relationships with people in the community. You can't just kind of arrive and start and expect to recruit participants, for example, without having built those relationships, without building trust, without making sure that people feel like they're part of this project and that they understand what it is. I mean, not ever, I don't think, but certainly not in a context where trust and relationships and fear are already a huge issue.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it would be totally counterproductive. I just don't think you shoot yourself in the foot, because you may physically not even be able to get participants through the door, but it's. I feel like community engagement, and obviously I have a vested interest in it, but it's the backbone of everything, and it's an investment in the trial as much as you would train your clinical staff before you allowed them to perform any kind of procedure, or make sure that you had all of the logistics behind you that you needed. It's not an added extra. I feel like if you don't invest in it right from the very beginning, and like Tom has said, it requires some budget, but it's not the biggest budget in the world. What we were doing was really quite simple, but without it, we physically wouldn't have got participants through the door, or if we got them through the door, we wouldn't have retained them in the trial over time.
Yeah, because they wouldn't have understood what it was that they were signing up for, perhaps.
And I think it's also the ethics around it. So as much as you might have an informed consent procedure, well, you would if it was a clinical trial. Informed consent is not a one-time process. I don't think the first time that you should be seeing that information, particularly if you're in a community which isn't used to medical research, you shouldn't walk into the clinic with all of these people around you who, even if they're not saying anything, presumably make you feel some pressure to sign up. It takes a lot more to say no and walk out of that room than it does to say yes. And so just for the ethics of it, people need to know what is happening before they even arrive at the clinic. They should have some understanding and some knowledge, even if that's then supplemented during the formal informed consent process.
And to wrap up then, my final question, if you were to advise yourselves, if you had a time travelling capacity and were to advise yourselves, or somebody who is designing, maybe thinking about this from the perspective of somebody with an overarching responsibility for a trial such as EboVac, what would you recommend they do in terms of planning for communications, community engagement and social research within their trial?
So there's one thing that struck me and continues to strike me as I still work on EboVac and PreVac, the other trial, is that if you had the time to build your trial protocol with people, community representatives of some sort, to make sure that the things that you're proposing are going to be, acceptable, appropriate for that community, that will save you a lot of bother down the line. The reality is, I think quite often the trial protocol is developed before it gets to the point of being explained to a community, and then you kind of come across these hurdles, many of which you will expect, like, blood taking. Nobody likes giving blood. I don't like giving blood. And if you're in a community where it's not something you normally do, you probably don't like giving blood either. But there are some of those things that you could identify earlier. You can also, maybe help to build a bit of a sense of ownership in that protocol, that it's something that's co-designed. Now, the reality is that protocol has got to satisfy the demands of whatever the sponsor needs to get that product licensed through the data they need to gather. But if you can engage a community in the protocol design, I think that would save you a huge amount of bother down the line.
Yeah, this is actually something that we talk a lot about in our papers and in the stuff that we've written together, but also, we still talk a lot about the role of social science in clinical trials, for example. And I think for me, that's one of the things that I would also really emphasize. Having identified in our work the fact that people's understanding of what is ethical in the first place is something that's up for discussion and something that's very much kind of grounded in local notions of morality and what's right and what's wrong. I think that even if the end product would end up potentially being the same, or being able to explain that there are certain things that you can't move or that are necessary for getting licensing, that just the process of discussing together what would make this process ethical for people, what would make it more meaningful for the community in which it's happening, would be I think incredibly useful. But as Tom says, there isn't always a time, but if there is, and I think if it could be something that's embedded in kind of ethical practice of how you deliver a clinical trial, I think would be really important. And the other kind of advice, so this is advice to us, I guess, but the advice to others, I think, is what the system that we've developed of social science and community engagement rather than social science as community engagement, for me is really, I think it worked well, and I think it's something that could be further developed, but that collaboration was, for me, one of the things that I'd advise people to think about.
Yeah, the collaboration and the separation of the roles, I think, is really important. I think if I was advising anybody else, it would be, don't have it all as one role done by one person. It has to be separated out. In terms of advice to myself, I think we became more innovative as time went on, but I think I wish maybe we'd been a bit more innovative, maybe with things like consent at the beginning. I think there's a really preconceived idea of how consent should be done, and involving lots of forms and pieces of paper and being signed, and we sort of became more innovative with we still had the forms, but trying things like audio consent and things like that. And I think trying to do things a bit differently and not having preconceived ideas about what might or might not work right from the start. Yeah, I don't know.
It sounds
it's probably
like
loads of advice, but
yeah, it sounds like you were reactive and responsive in a lot of capacities then, even down to the process of consent taking. That was just incredibly rich. Thank you so much. And you've published on your collaboration and some of your findings.
Yeah, so we can, hopefully we can link to some of the papers, but we have some that are specifically about the relationship between social science and community engagement.
We'll link to them through the MESH website.
And it might also, Tom, it might be useful to link to the one that you wrote.
Yeah, we've published also on lessons learned on about setting up a clinical trial during an outbreak, but that does include community engagement.
As it certainly should.
Yeah, of course.
Wonderful. We'll definitely link to them through the MESH website in that case, should people want to delve deeper. But thank you, all three of you, for an incredibly rich conversation and for having done incredibly valuable work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.